all who are here, both in person and virtually. Thank you so much, Leilani Farha, for joining us today. We're really fortunate to have her with us for this week of events. So much to think about, so many issues to deal with. I think the variety of conversations, the engagement of broader community folks in these conversations is really, really central to thinking about a university community approach to addressing these issues in Pittsburgh, and certainly something we're seeing in broader strategies that are being used around the world. I'm really pleased to join the Center for Global Studies, Urban Studies, as co-sponsors for this event, along with us from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and great to see a number of our students here as well. It's my great pleasure to be able to share an introduction of Leilani Farha today. She is the Global Director of SHIFT, which is an international movement to secure the right to housing, and also a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right of housing, or the right to housing, from 2014 to 2020. The SHIFT was launched in 2017, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and United Cities and Local Governments. It works with multi-level stakeholders around the world, including several city governments in North America and also in Europe. Leilani's work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity. She has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, rights-based housing approaches, and the first UN guidelines for the implementation of a right to housing. She is the central character as well in the award-winning documentary Push, regarding the financialization of housing. It's directed by Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Gertten. Push is screening around the world, and to continue its momentum, Leilani and Fredrik now co-host a podcast, Pushback Talks, about finance, housing, and human rights. I encourage you to check it out. As we grapple, as Lisa helped us think about as we started off the day today, as we grapple with so many challenges related to safe and affordable housing, definitely nearby and absolutely around the world, Leilani Farha's work is so crucial. The significance, I think, of a human rights-based approach to housing has so much potential to change the narrative, potential to change the governmental and decision-making structures around housing, affordability, access, the finance structure, and most importantly, at the core of this is it has the potential to change people's lives. I can't wait to learn more. I'm glad to be here with all of you today, and I want to thank Leilani for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Take off the mask so I can speak clearly with this jet-lagged throat and voice. It is such an honor to have been given the opportunity for this 1 week H.J. Hines Visiting Fellowship. And I'm so pleased to participate in Fair Housing Month this week. I have to give a huge thanks to my hosts at the Global Study Center and all of the other centers and faculties, et cetera, that made this happen, and community organizers as well. I've been greeted so warmly, and I know it takes a huge amount of effort to deal with all of the logistics, and I admit I'm not always the easiest person to satisfy in some things. So a huge thanks, and thanks, Jackie, in particular for liaising with my staff and making this happen. For this opening lecture, I thought I would ruminate for about 30 minutes or so on some of the aspects of the global housing crisis and what we can do to address it. And then I'd open it up for discussion. So let me put this down before I spill it. These days, I'm fixated on two numbers. 1.8 billion and 220 trillion. Whenever I travel to a new city, which I haven't done much of during the pandemic, but previously, I'm back out there now, I really love to walk around to get to know the city. I love looking up. And in most places where I go, when I look up, what I see, most places, are tall cranes on the horizon, steel and glass buildings going up, old buildings being refurbished or repurposed, advertising five-star living, promoting a five-star lifestyle. At night, when I walk around these same cities, I often see dark towers, lights off, nobody home. In these same cities, on these same walks, I also see people living on the streets, under bridges, under highways, in tents, in parks, hanging by a thread. These experiences and contrasting realities are as true in London, England, Toronto, Canada, or Cairo, Egypt, or Lagos, Nigeria. And it's this gap that worries me and interests me. The gap between those on the streets and the skyscrapers going up. And that visual manifestation of inequality that plagues so many cities across the planet. It's the gap between $220 trillion that represents the global value of residential real estate right now, making it the biggest business in the world, bigger than pharmaceuticals, bigger than tobacco, bigger than the amount of gold ever mined. And the 1.8 billion people living in grossly inadequate housing and homelessness across the world who cannot afford a decent, adequate place to live. So let me pause for a moment. I just want to unpack that 220 trillion for you, because that's going to be the focus of a lot of my comments today and this week. What is $220 trillion? So that's the global value of residential real estate, $220 trillion. You should be shaking your head because you don't know what that means, and neither do I. Professor Saskia Sassen says it exits the domain of money. She's so great. If you haven't seen Push, you have to see Push just to see her. She's so great. If you took the GDP of every country around the world and then multiplied, so added them all up and then doubled that amount, so multiplied by 2, you still wouldn't get $220 trillion. So that's like the economies of the US and China included in that calculation. So this gap between 220 trillion and 1.8 billion represents the mismatch between the ever-increasing cost and value of housing and the actual income of people living in housing need. People who are homeless, low-income people, working minimum wage jobs, and more often than not, racialized communities. And in this country, in particular, of course, African Americans. So the question is, how did we get to this place, to what is indeed, as the speaker before me said, what is indeed a global housing crisis, where housing is unaffordable for the bulk of the population and used by the already wealthy few to grow their wealth. How has it become the counterintuitive reality that the richer a nation, a region, a city, the more likely you are to see growing homelessness and housing precarity? The US is the richest country in the world and yet has more than 500,000 people, as you know, living in homelessness. 25%, I think, of that population lives in California. California has the 5th largest GDP in the world, right? Rivaling the UK, I think, in terms of GDP. As I understand it, this mismatch, is affecting Pittsburgh as well. I read that home prices increased by about 14.5% in the last year. And that by my calculations, I did a little fiddling with numbers, that close to 75% of the rental housing stock in the city, these are 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, are priced such that you'd have to be earning between $60,000 and $70,000 a year for those units to be affordable. In other words, not more than 30% of household income. However, meanwhile, 50% of your population can't reach this threshold. with 20% of your population living in poverty and 50% of your population earning less than $50,000 a year. And of course, like every other city in America, Pittsburgh does seem to have a sizable homeless population, and perhaps made worse by the pandemic. I hope to learn about that as I spend the week here. While forced evictions, homelessness, grossly inadequate housing conditions have existed in cities around the world for a very long time, what is remarkable to me is the permanency of these conditions despite the world's ever-increasing wealth, even during a pandemic. Surely economies experiencing growth should benefit the entire population. Otherwise, what's the point of economic growth? And I think that's a question we should keep asking ourselves, because governments are always saying we need to grow, we need economic growth. Well, yet maybe if it's going to benefit the general population, low income, racialized communities, for example. This ever-increasing gap between housing's worth and those living in precarious housing conditions is a long time in the making, no doubt rooted in neoliberal policies advanced in this country by Ronald Reagan, by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, among others. The trickle-down ideology that put its stock in the private market producing good results for vulnerable and marginalized populations. Neoliberalism of the late 70s and early 80s that hangs on until today has eroded tenant protections while simultaneously giving a kind of corporate welfare to private actors as if they are the solution rather than the problem. This ideology was made worse, of course, and ironically, after the global financial crisis. It was at that time that, excuse me, the big financial actors, private equity firms in particular, pension funds and other investors realized that they could use housing not just to extract wealth, but use housing to create new financial instruments and make a lot of money by using housing as security to leverage more capital. And that's actually how it works. The best example is, of course, Blackstone. Many of you will have heard of the large private equity firm. It's one of the largest in the world. They went basically after the global financial crisis in around 2012, they went on what I would call a shopping spree. They purchased something like 50,000 foreclosed homes. These were called distressed assets, you'll recall. And were foreclosed mostly because of predatory lending practices. These 50,000 homes were purchased basically in like one transaction, if you can imagine, in the US. They used new technology, so they were harnessing the tech industry and what they could produce for them. And suddenly, like that, Blackstone became one of the largest, I think the single largest landlord in the US at that time. Since then, this model has really taken hold. Buy an asset, put the place on the stock market, renovate whether necessary or not, and then increase rent and fees associated with the property, making them unreachable for most tenants or unaffordable for most tenants. In some instances, the model means, means that the shareholder, because most of these properties are basically put on the stock market, the shareholder becomes the client, not the tenant. And that's why I try to refuse to call these actors landlords, because they're really only acting in the interests of their clients who are shareholders and investors. This is the financialization of housing. The impact is to directly undermine two central tenets of the right to housing affordability and security of tenure. The business model associated with the financialization of housing is one that requires that rents continuously increase and that uses evictions and displacement as a method to do so. So get rid of the tenant, jack up the rent. And it's always get rid of the lower income tenant and bring in a higher income tenant. This is, of course, not news here in Pittsburgh. I think in the 2000s, you've seen the destruction of public housing in the city and a push toward more luxury class dwellings, which few can afford, rather than a push toward affordable housing. And I know Jackie, for example, has some really interesting numbers in the white paper, the authors of the white paper, around how many units have been lost through these processes. And it's really, it's a huge amount for a small city like Pittsburgh. The 2021 census here documented a 13% decline in Pittsburgh's Black population over the decade. And they tied the decline to the lack of affordable housing in the city. A contributing factor is, of course, also ongoing systemic discrimination by residential lenders, which obviously aggravates the effects of the redlining that the speakers before me mentioned. A 2021 report found that between 2007 and 2019, only 7% of home loans, which amounted to about $12 billion, went to Pittsburgh's minority residents. So, stark reality here. And so institutional actors, as I said, are using housing as a financial instrument. And I'll just be clear again with who these institutional actors are, because some of you may work for a university and may have a pension fund, and you should look at where your pension fund is investing. So the institutional actors tend to be private equity firms, pension funds, and insurance companies. Those are the big ones. One of the things that we note, and I think this has traditionally been the case in the city of Pittsburgh, is these actors also have not just money power, but they almost invariably have a seat at political tables. So they're able to influence both with the power of their resources and by sitting at those political tables. And that has to really be seriously looked at. So now I want to talk about what to do about this. And this is where we start getting into strategy stuff. I believe strongly in the transformational power of human rights. I do think one of the central issues that we as societies across the world are contending with is how do we undo and address the housing crisis affecting so many cities across the planet? I mean, I think this is without a doubt right up there with the climate crisis. And I firmly believe that the only way we will get to a better place is if governments embrace a paradigmatic shift, embrace the idea that housing is a social good and a fundamental human right. And I don't just mean embrace it with a few words. I mean integrate that understanding in legislative reform, new legislation, and in all policy making and decision making. Governments will have to familiarize themselves with what it means to treat housing as a human right, that it is the right to live in peace, security, and with dignity. And it is the right to live in an affordable place with secure tenure. And affordability under human rights law is understood as what a household can bear, what is commensurate with household income, not what the private market can command. Security of tenure means long-term leases, rent caps, the elimination of no-fault evictions and evictions into homelessness, a ban on rent evictions, and an exploration of and implementation of new tenure forms, or old ones, but revitalized, like cooperatives and land trusts. So let me just tell you why I think human rights are transformational, because a lot of people ask me, like, oh, it sounds nice, but like, what's the value of human rights? And I think I've come up with some sort of things that you can use as you go about trying to convince others that a human rights frame is the right one. First of all, to me, I am a little bit linear sometimes. I'm a human rights lawyer, and so I do think kind of linearly. And it just makes sense that when you have a human rights problem, that it should be resolved using human rights and human rights principles. And we know that the lived experience of homelessness and inadequate housing challenges to the very core what it means to be human. It can be an assault on human dignity. Some of the conditions people are living in can threaten life itself. I mean, if you go from being housed to unhoused, that is that puts you at much greater risk of having a much shorter life expectancy. It's that simple. And housing precarity, if you feel that you might be evicted at any moment or you won't be able to pay the rent, causes incredible amount of stress and in many cases undignified conditions. And so it's clear that these are human rights matters that we're talking about, and they therefore deserve human rights response. I think human rights, this is like my favorite thing about human rights, is they clarify accountability. Under international human rights law, it's very clear that all levels of government, whether it's city or local governments, state governments, or national level governments, governments are accountable to people. And particularly to marginalized and vulnerable groups. Human rights make it clear that while ensuring access to adequate housing for all involves many actors, it is the legal obligation of states, and by states I mean all levels of government, to be both a key actor and to regulate private actors to make sure those private actors aren't infringing human rights obligations. Human rights also change how, or should change how, governments interact with people. This is also something that's super important, and it really gets to kind of the heart of what democracy should look like, but certainly doesn't any longer, if it ever did. Those who are homeless or living in inadequate housing are generally, in most societies, especially in Western Northern societies, they're viewed as recipients of charity, right? Oh, you can go to that mission and get a free meal. You can go there and get some personal hygiene products. You can get some, a place to sleep at a shelter. That is all a charitable model. Well, under a human rights model, those individuals, people living in homelessness, people living in housing precarity, are rights holders. Well, that changes the game. That changes the narrative entirely, and it changes how governments should interact with people. So you just imagine, I love doing this. Just imagine, city councilors are sitting around, or the city housing department is sitting around, and the conversation has to change when you recognize that people living in homelessness and housing precarity are rights holders. Suddenly, it's not, what crumbs can we give, but rather, we have some major housing problems on our hands, and we have to solve them so that we can ensure the right to housing as these groups are entitled to. It's a different conversation. It means that government policies and programs and laws would ensure a responsiveness to the actual lived experiences of people living in housing precarity. And it would mean engaging with those communities directly to know what the issues are, what the barriers are, and to brainstorm resolutions or solutions. I do think that it's through that model where you're recognizing those living in housing precarity as rights holders who should be engaged, who are experts in their own lives. That's how governments will figure out what the gaps in the system are, what the structural problems are, what the weaknesses are. If you're a government official, mostly, not always, but you're probably decently housed, and you probably don't have quite an acute sense of what the needs and barriers are. And so by engaging the population, that's how you find out. And populations are incredibly resourceful. They always have answers to the problems that they're facing. They just can't always implement those answers because they don't always have the resources. Human rights also have primacy over other laws and provide a framework for governance. I always say this to government officials. Human rights is a way of governing. It's a way of making decisions, and it compels certain decisions. And I don't think governments always realize that. I think they think of human rights as aspirational, kind of weak, namby-pamby, sort of up there in the sky. And I try to get governments to realize, no, it's actually a way for you to govern. So when you're crafting policy, you're engaging with communities, and you're always thinking the outcome of this has to be safe, secure, affordable housing for the most vulnerable populations, the most marginalized populations in my community. I do think that the idea of asserting housing as a human right through law and policy is gaining traction across the planet. I mean, I've been at this for a fair while, certainly at a global scale for 8 years, and I've definitely seen a shift. At the national level, and I'll just give you a few examples. At the national level, Canada, Portugal, and Spain, for example, have all recently asserted through legislation that housing is a human right. So in legislation. In the case of Canada, this is a huge step. Canada, like the United States, has long been a naysayer about housing as a human right. I know President Biden fairly recently said that it is a human right, and I know there's a new conversation happening in this country. Well, Canada, the same thing happened. We ended up with a prime minister who was a little more amenable to the idea that housing is a human right. He still doesn't get it, but he can now articulate it. He doesn't quite say it right, but he's getting there. And Canada, we, a whole bunch of us advocates, managed to ram through some legislation that recognizes housing is a human right, and that shall guide the federal government's policy around housing. It's a pretty astonishing change. In the case of Canada, we also managed to get through the establishment of new accountability mechanisms to monitor the right to housing and its unfolding or its implementation in the country. In Spain and Portugal, the legislation tends to look more at tenant protections, but at national level. So really trying to guide regional governments and city governments. So the federal government sort of took that leadership position in both those countries and said, you know, we have to do better. We have to address homelessness. And in the case of Portugal, they're very keen on trying to eliminate homelessness in Portugal. And in Spain, it was kind of overarching tenant protection type legislation, but firmly rooted in the right to housing. Denmark has a new-ish rent freeze law, which is aimed specifically at detracting institutional investors from invading their housing market. Because institutional investors are looking for normally they need to have a good return within 5 years. So they want to get in, make the mess that they make, raise rents, and then get out in 5 years. Denmark said, you're welcome to come here, but you can't raise rents for 5 years. And so that has put a real chill on institutional investment in Denmark. But cities are also increasingly embracing the right to housing. I have lots of examples. I'll just give you a few. I'll talk again about Canada because I think this is kind of a cool thing. At the beginning of the pandemic, I could see that Canadian city officials, mayors, city councillors were really grappling with, in particular, homelessness, but also the threat of eviction of many people because they were losing their jobs and being paid rent. And in conjunction with the Canadian Urban Institute, which is quite distinct from the Urban Institute in the US, it's sort of a more progressive body. We decided to just throw open a table. Any municipal government, mayor, city councillor, housing department that wanted to come and sit down and talk about housing, human rights, and the pandemic was welcome to come. And we now have people came right away. We have several mayors from across the country. I think we now have 16 cities represented. And they themselves they've branded themselves the Right to Home Municipal Working Group. So every month we meet and we tackle an issue or an aspect of an issue and try to brainstorm what the human rights response to that issue would look like at city level. In Amsterdam, well, first, the mayor of Amsterdam tried to ban Airbnbs, which I consider to be a kind of financialization of housing because it is investor housing and it takes away from local housing stock. So the mayor tried to ban Airbnbs in very touristic locations within Amsterdam and managed to do so for a while, and then the law was challenged and it was deemed unconstitutional. But now they are considering trying to regulate the rent to buy market. I don't know in the States if this is a thing, but in other countries around the world, rent to buy is a whole thing. And it leads to obviously investor driven housing, right? So they buy. In Ireland, it's very common and it's having terrible effects and really increasing homelessness and housing precarity. In Burnaby, BC, I like this example, and I'm sorry to give another Canadian example, that's British Columbia, but it's one of the few examples I have of a municipality trying to regulate renovictions or the upgrading of buildings that then lead to displacement, which is happening here in Pittsburgh. So you might want to look at Burnaby's, but I think it's considered a bylaw, but it's very strong. It requires social contracts with developers. It requires one-for-one replacement of affordable units. So it might be the high water mark in this area. And then I'll just mention the city of Buenos Aires, and which has been considering a proposal to implement a vacant housing tax. I'm not sure how relevant that would be in Pittsburgh. I haven't been able to find the number of vacant homes here and what kind of homes they are. But that can lead to the owners of vacant units either selling those units and maybe then getting them back into circulation. It can lead to renting out those units so that they don't stand vacant, which can help if they're set at affordable rents, etc. Okay, so while all of these developments are pretty good, I have to say one of the things that worries me, and I think you all in Pittsburgh should be thinking about is, and I think you already have in fact, is, how good is it to have a piece like a policy here, a policy that got a policy on Airbnb and a vacant home tax, but sort of like, to me, it seems like pings or something, and yet we've got this huge structural problem. So I think we have to be careful. I think these developments, some of them that I mentioned are good, but they don't lead to structural change. I think the ones happening at the national level are better. I have to say that because they're legislated and they're taking that big overarching look. And so my sense is that if a paradigmatic shift is really to take hold, one that really addresses housing need and challenges housing commodifications, housing's commodification, I think it's important for all levels of government to adopt rights-based housing strategies. So strategies are bigger than policies, they're overarching, they should have certain principles, which I'll run through, to guide all housing and housing related policy. And I say housing related policy because we have to understand that housing is now finance. And so any policy in finance has to be examined for its implications on the housing sector. So I'm seeing rights-based housing strategies emerge at city level. I've seen it in Canada, in Barcelona, in Berlin. I think they're thinking of this. So it is emerging. The question is, what does it look like? And I developed a whole long 20-page thematic report on this. So obviously I'm not going to relay that to you now, but I'll just run through some of the principles so that you get a sense of what this strategy might look like. It should be based in law and legal standards. In other words, you should have a law in the books that says that the city of Pittsburgh is required to enact and maintain a rights-based housing strategy. So that means that no matter who your mayor is, they are required to keep a rights-based housing strategy in place. That's super important, right? Because we know what happens with the coming and going of governments. A rights-based strategy would prioritize those most in need and ensure equality. It would be comprehensive and whole of government. That's what I was talking about before, not just looking at housing policies, but also looking at things like short-term rental policies, policies around taxation, etc. It should include rights-based participation, which I already discussed, engaging communities so that they can actually affect decisions that affect their lives. And that is what makes participation rights-based. If you bring a community, we're not talking focus groups. We're not talking check marks. Oh yeah, I spoke with that community. No, it's engaging in a meaningful way so that people can affect the decisions that will impact on their lives. There should be measurable goals and timelines in the strategy. We will achieve this by such and such date, and this is how it will be measured, and this is who's going to monitor that. And there should be independent monitoring where possible. There also should be some kind of an accountability mechanism, a way for people who are experiencing housing challenges that are structural in nature. I'm not talking about individual complaints, I'm talking about structural complaints. There should be a place to go to have those complaints heard. That's like an access to justice kind of part of all of this. It's very important. And lastly, a rights-based housing strategy would clarify the obligations of private actors and would regulate financial housing and real estate markets. Okay, I'm just going to close now because I think my daughter gave me the "you've been talking for too long" sign, which I asked her to do. Let me just close with a few comments about Pittsburgh. And like, I'm here, this is day one, right? So I might get this wrong, and I'm open to that, but I just wanted to say a few things. First of all, I do see that Pittsburgh seems to be on a similar path to many other cities. And the white paper that's been written about this is amazing and really, I mean, provides a kind of, in such a succinct way, I was like very amazing. What's happened to Pittsburgh and what's happening in Pittsburgh. The cost of housing is increasing. New developments are emerging that benefit developers and more affluent people and are not intended for low-income people. I've heard that out-of-towners like New Yorkers are coming to Pittsburgh and buying properties because it's cheaper, and obviously they're going to be looking for a good return. I heard house flipping is a thing here that can be hugely problematic if it gets out of control. And I've heard that the city itself is being touted externally as one where investment returns are quite high because housing remains relatively to other jurisdictions in the country cheap. And so these are alarm bells. These are alarm bells. These are the red flags. But from the statistics, from what I can tell, and you might strike me down now, but is that it hasn't gotten totally out of control. It seems that the situation is salvageable. Unlike some like if you look at LA, for example, sorry, but very complicated, or in my own country, Toronto, very complicated. I'm feeling like you're not quite there yet in Pittsburgh. You're a small town. The stats look okay. The most disturbing and hard to undo trend is, of course, the displacement of your Black population. Very, very worrying. I mean, yeah, it has to be addressed, in my opinion, on an urgent and priority basis. And I think the only way to do that is through a human rights-based strategy that extends to every decision taken that might affect housing in the city. I do think there should be some attempt at some restorative thing, but I'm not sure what that would look like. I haven't got my head around what that could look like. That being said, I think there's already a lot in place to move you forward quite quickly. It's amazing to me, actually. So, Pittsburgh was proclaimed a human rights city in 2011. That's a great basis. Even if it's kind of weak and whatever, it's still a really great basis. The Commission on Human Relations seems ready to draft, with partners, I assume, a fair housing strategy, and seems very engaged in housing issues. They had that report, the task force report, I think it is, with a set of really good recommendations, or they look good to me. I read them fairly quickly. I think it included in the recommendations a fair fair housing criteria for development projects, which I thought was interesting, probably needs to be a little more robust. And you have the white paper really, which gives you a kind of roadmap of what's happened and includes recommendations, including the task force recommendations. So all of that's really great. And then on top of it, you have a recently elected mayor, Mayor Gainey, who committed to ensuring residents of Pittsburgh have access to affordable housing. I see that he has had some discussions with Walnut Capital. I don't know. I'll leave that at that. I'm going to leave that there. The mayor will need the support of the community, of academics, advocates, of various communities, if he's going to travel down this road successfully. He will be under a huge amount of pressure from the developers, 100% for sure. And so he'll need to know that if he goes down this road, that people have his back as well. But it is his job, definitely, to step up and step into the housing arena and to lead rather than being led. So I'm super excited to be here in Pittsburgh. I think the window of opportunity here is short, and I hope you use it and that it's not lost. Happy to have this. So should I guess I should stay up here if there are going to be questions, right? Yes?
Yeah, and we'll be handling the Zoom questions back here. We already have a few,
Okay.
but for folks in person, if you just want to raise your hand, we'll just hop back and forth, start in person, and then we'll go to Zoom.
Sure.
So I have two comments and a question. So I've lived in Pittsburgh my whole life. Both my parents were born in Pittsburgh, and it used to be that, buying a house was the way you secured middle-class status. Both my parents grew up in Lawrenceville, which at the time was a working class neighborhood. And now they bought a house out in the suburbs back in the 90s. And you look at the house and you hear how much they paid for the house and you say, oh, that looks like a correct price for the house. And now these days, what's happened in Pittsburgh is when I graduated from undergraduate from Pittsburgh, the most common parlance of young professionals was that Pittsburgh was a good starter city. It was affordable, but it seems that since the pandemic, housing prices have skyrocketed, especially with rentals. And my second comment is that, like, if you want to understand the history of Pittsburgh and real estate and how minorities have gone the short end of the stick, you have to understand what happened with the construction of the Civic Arena in the late 50s, early 60s, when basically the city basically tore down half the Hill District in Pittsburgh, which at the time was one of the most thriving Black communities in the country, home of August Wilson, was commonly referred to as Little Brooklyn. And now it's one of the poorest Black communities in the country, and it's a food desert. And then, so it kind of ties in my question, it's like, what's the end game here? Because I don't see the political capital in the United States, just focusing on the United States, to fix the housing market. And it just seems like there's no reform after 2008. No financiers went to jail. The banks just got more consolidated. And it seems like there's no political will on either side to tackle the issue. So are we looking at maybe like the financial institutions are sleepwalking to another housing collapse? Because I don't understand how you can build all these luxury apartments, not all of them get built, and if it's empty, how is that a financial asset? Like what? I know, and then it's just like you think through everything, and you're just and you like, okay, how can we solve this process? You go through the steps, and you're like, I don't see how that realistically is done. So sorry, I kind of rambled a little bit. So like, where do you see things going in like the short term, like 5 to 10 years?
First of all, I love your rambling.
Sorry.
No, and you nailed so many things. Stopping the financial actors is absolutely key. And you can try to do some of that at city level. It has to happen at national level as well. I mean, in fact, in the white paper, there's some really good examples of the way in which national level policy is enabling these actors, and through, for example, affordable housing schemes, and the way tax credits, I don't want to get into all those details, but the way tax credits are working. What's really scary is the big institutional investors are buying up those contracts actually, and the affordable housing contracts, they're actually being paid. Like they get so, like the tax credits are bigger than in fact the investment that they have to make. So they're being paid, like it's so sickening. If you think that big institutional investors are being in fact paid to then deliver with community partners affordable housing. Some of those contracts will come up. They're like 30-year contracts. So they'll be coming up soon, some of those. And then they can convert those units into market rate. So it's very scary terrain. I think it's called Hope 4. Is that what it is? Hope 4, Hope 6, Hope 6, yeah. Anyway, stopping the financial actors is key. And so you kind of need things happening at, you know, two levels. You need a strong mayor and a strong mayor's office who can be trying to push and drive developers to contribute to the implementation of the right to housing at the local level through a variety of means and mechanisms that the city has, levers that the city has. But you need people advocating at the national level to change the tax laws. A lot of this is happening because the institutional investors get cheap to change tax laws and change interest rates. Investors get cheap money, like they get money for free. They pay like no interest on the money that they borrow, and it enables them to leverage. And so you got to make money less cheap for them, and they often don't pay taxes. So you remember when I said, you know, they put housing on the stock market for shareholders. Well, they're paying dividends out to those shareholders, and there's this whole tax regime for that. They're real estate investment trusts, and they don't pay income tax. So if we just started to deal with some of these structural pieces, we would see a lot of this stuff go away. I mean, I'm actually way more radical than what I've just said. I mean, I actually think we shouldn't even allow advertising for luxury housing and all investment in housing and whatever. But those are other ideas. I will just say this. I am developing a set of human rights directives on the financialization of housing. And it covers every way in which housing has been financialized. And it's aimed at getting this in the hands of advocates who are working at both the top level, national level, as well as at city level and state level, to use these directives to try to push for change. But I mean, as I said, the window of opportunity in a place like Pittsburgh is small. I mean, it's all the facts on the ground are lining up in a not good way. Have already lined up some of them, but so I don't know if that answered it, but
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah.
keep hope alive. You gotta work hard. So now do we go to?
We got a Zoom question back here.
Juliet Martinez is from the Hazelwood Initiative Incorporated here in Pittsburgh. And she asks, is the idea of a citywide inclusionary zoning ordinance mandating affordable housing and new development a good strategy in your view?
Inclusionary zoning is complicated because, well, you know, it depends on the percentage, for example. So, and the percentage should be tied to actual need in every community, which it rarely is. So if you look at inclusionary zoning, everywhere around the world, it's like 10% or sometimes 25% if you're lucky. But like, why would it be the same in every city across the world? Like, surely Pittsburgh's needs are different than London, England's needs are different than the needs in Singapore. So that was one thing that worries me about inclusionary zoning. Another thing that the percentage of I hope I'm being clear, the percentage of units, it has to be like, you have to do an audit of your city. How many people are living in housing need? How many people are living in homelessness? How many people, we say core housing need, it's when you're paying more than 30% of your income on rent, for example. What's the growth of your population? How many young people should be segueing to apartments of a lot, right? You need to have an audit of your city. And then it can become clear within each community what the inclusionary zoning rate should be based on need. It's never done that way. That would be a human rights approach. That's what. Two, in my experience, the negotiations the developers use with inclusionary zoning is disgusting. They will argue for less property. They pay less property tax. Well, that doesn't benefit the city, you know? Meanwhile, they want less property tax, and then all the roads leading to the building are provided by city or state or whatever. They get around inclusionary zoning. They want to build up higher if they have X number of units that are actually affordable. They quibble around what the affordability rate will be within inclusionary zoning. It's often like 80% of market rent, which is still unaffordable for most people. So seems to me it's something. It can be used. I don't think that's the silver bullet. Let's get it out. I'd love to know what other people think about inclusionary zoning. I'm a real downer on inclusionary zoning. I mean, I haven't seen anywhere where it's been really good. In Montreal, they have a different kind of inclusionary zoning where they call it 20, I think. So it's any new build in the city of Montreal has to be 20% social housing, 20% affordable, and affordable is a percentage of market rent. It's not very affordable, and 20% has to be family housing, like, so, you know, 3+ bedrooms. That's a little bit better, I think, because of that social component. But again, how do they come up with 20? And it's a city under siege, financialization siege. So
you mentioned about need for a strong mayor and strong mayor's office, having that support behind you. You mentioned the Walmart capital that the whole negotiation, like they got 10% of them be affordable housing. It's something, but my question really went to about building support with people, because a lot of, showing for a politician that there is support behind them for this kind of approach. And especially when, I know in America, a lot of times people view their greatest asset in their life is their house. They put, as the gentleman above said, you buy a house and that's where all of your money is sunk. And so there's a lot of times, when people talk about how, housing human right, I think they have different ideas in their head. Oh, you're going to put, you're going to put duplexes there. It's going to reduce my property value. And that's going to impact what my retirement is going to be. And so how do you reach people who are looking at this, because so much of their wealth is put is that's what's the retirement savings? I'm going to sell my house, and then it'll be at the end of the day. And how do you communicate these approaches to build that support? When looking at this, strict people are saying, hey, it's finances. My house is worth more, and I need that money later. How do we speak to those kind of people?
yeah, it's not easy, and what you just said at the end there just is a reminder to us all that we really do need big structural change, where one's home is not the only way to have security, long-term security. We used to live in a world where that was maybe part of the equation in the US and Canada, for example, certainly not in Europe, because homeownership isn't as big, except Southern Europe. But we used to have jobs that pay decent wages, often, not always, that were unionized, and that you had a pension at the end of. And those have disappeared. And part of this unaffordability is, if you look at wages, it's not actually, the United States is not quite as bad as some other places, believe it or not, but which is still just shocking because your minimum wages are so low here. But if you look generally, you see in most places, the graph is the same. And I mean, most places, like even in Africa, wages and housing costs. And so, anyway, that's the end of your question. The beginning of your question, how to talk to people and get them to understand. One of the things that people are surprised about human rights and a human rights approach is it's not actually that prescriptive. So I read you those principles, right? Well, those are high level. It doesn't say you must have cooperative housing, you must have X percentage of social housing. It does say that most places will need social housing as a base. So the US you all have gotten not you all, but governments in the US have gotten rid of most social housing or public housing. And so, I mean, these are difficult conversations, but it has to be understood that what we're talking about when we talk about human rights is options. People need options, housing options that are commensurate with their income. That to me is a no-brainer. I can't imagine anyone arguing against that. I don't think most people like homelessness on the streets. I don't think people like having a lot of shelters and food insecure people. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic when there were those huge lineups? I mean, that was making international media, right? I mean, no one likes to see that. I've never met a government official if I say to them, you've got, let's say here, almost 1,000 people living in homelessness. How do you feel about that? No one says, no government official, oh, I think it's great, right? It is recognized as a social problem. And so then we want to talk about options, and that's what human rights gives us, is it forces the assurance that you will have options as a student to have housing that's commensurate with your student income, and that as a new worker in the workforce, you'll have options which might be rental accommodation that you can afford. So I think that's one way in, always looking for commonality and trying to, in this day and age, we are societies driven by difference, and we really need to move away from that. And that's a bigger piece. But always trying to look for that commonality. One of the things I also want to say about home ownership, which sets me apart from a lot of my housing advocate colleagues and friends, I actually don't want to give up the idea of home ownership as a way to create intergenerational wealth. Because if, like in your country, I think it's so unfair, like unless we have alternatives to home ownership, which right now we don't. I don't want to say to African Americans, suddenly we're going to go some other route. You can't get intergenerational wealth through home ownership. That seems totally unfair to me after redlining. And so we need to figure out just a way for it not to be the only way to create intergenerational wealth. That's what I think. But it just seems, we have this conversation in Canada a lot too. It's like, oh, we should be talking more about renting. I think, well, fine, but why just now? Like I was thinking in the pandemic, it could have been a good time for lower income households to get into the housing market. And as I'm saying that, I'm also hearing people say, no, everyone should be a renter now. I'm thinking, wasn't that convenient? Just as lower income people might be able to get in, we're going to say no. That didn't seem fair to me. So, yes.
Sabina, you may go.
Okay, thank you. Leilani, Sabina Dietrich here, and pleasure. We had a great discussion on Friday with the Pitts Law Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice. We really appreciate all your work, and I want to thank Jackie again for everything she's done in arranging your trip. One of the things that makes our area different in some ways, and I really do appreciate your saying the window is open and it's going to close quickly here. You're absolutely right on that. And you're right on many of the things that you've been discussing. And I agree with a lot, and including, the option for home ownership for many people. And that's why it's a little bit, our mayor's on board, but it's getting it to a larger venue. We've got, and this is some of the metropolitan regionalism that you're familiar with from Canada in some respects, but we've got 130 local governments here in Allegheny County alone. And then we have outlying areas that are still on the decline, really never really recovered from deindustrialization in most places. The mentality of our metropolitan planning organization, who in many places the MPO takes the lead now on affordable housing regionally because it's a regional issue and tied to obviously regional labor markets as well. But we still have many places that are in the affordable world. And the residents and especially a lot of local officials see their communities as places where no one ever got the big appreciation on the equity scale, but they always had places for their kids to buy houses. And A lot of our communities, particularly get a little farther away from the city of Pittsburgh, work on that. We also still have very, very depressed communities that never recovered from deindustrialization. These are outlying, particularly east of the city. It's where the spillover of people who can't afford or got kicked out of apartments and couldn't afford the rents here in the east end of the city or other parts moved to other communities with, of course, fewer services and transportation options. So quality of life issues have declined on numerous scales. What can you say about trying to forge a metropolitan dialogue on this as well, so that places that see it, oh, that's Pittsburgh's problem, not ours, realize that, you know, it's coming soon to them. We've also outlined some of the recent SFR REIT purchases, and we've got a lot of these communities that they're the biggest buyers in some of them. We didn't, as I said on Friday, we don't necessarily have Bridgewater yet, but we have plenty of other local, national, and international single-family residential REITs that are buying up properties in that affordable range, and particularly the eastern suburbs and some of our southern neighborhoods.
Yeah, thanks for that. Is it Sabina? Is that right?
Sabina, yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm already learning a ton about Pittsburgh, so this is great. I don't know how the 130 local governments, is that what you said? 130 local
Yeah, it's
governments?
hard to believe the number.
That's crazy. So in so many jurisdictions, amalgamation has happened, but I notice in the US not as much. So where you amalgamate all those local governments into something bigger. So I don't know what structures exist for those local governments for cross-pollination amongst them, but that is super important. I'm finding that these days, what we need are new structures of communication, structures for communication, for cross-pollination. So I don't know if there is such a thing that exists. There must be some kind of regional meeting that they have, or one of the things I've experienced, I was laughing when you said, you know, how do we get governments to realize, you know, this is a phenomenon coming to them soon. And it's so hard. I've had that experience where I go to governments and I sit local governments and I'm saying, so I read landscapes, I read statistics, I can tell when things are on the move. I've walked around your community, you're in trouble. And they look at me, they're like, they just don't have a clue. And particularly what you said at the end, Sabina, about this purchasing of affordable single-family properties by the big institutional investors or by big asset management firms. They go by all sorts of different names. I mean, I would think Pittsburgh would be ripe for that, and I would be very afraid about that. And I would be prioritizing the protection of any and every existing affordable unit and getting the mayor to be on top of that. That to me is absolutely key, because if you read any of the articles in the New Yorker, in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, there have been so many articles recently about Wall Street on the move in the residential real estate sector. And what they're looking for is exactly what Sabina says you have still here, maybe not just in Pittsburgh, but in all of those other regions around Pittsburgh itself. They're looking for older stock that is still affordable, that they can mine for wealth and leveraging. So I think, I mean, I'm happy to raise alarm bells on your behalf if I'm fed the right information, because for sure that's financialization, and that's what's happening. And it happened during the pandemic at such a fast rate, when all of us were worrying about the health and safety of our families and whether we were going to imagine, you know, trying to just save your home. So much was purchased in this 2-year period. So it's very alarming. I'll leave it there.
Thanks.
So there's 3 questions here. Sure, I'll go quick. I wonder if you've seen positive examples of how a rights-based approach, and especially a narrative, can be used to address public opposition to affordable housing and especially density. I think as we're thinking about at the development or project scale, one of the big challenges that often bubbles up is that opposition from neighbors, or landowners nearby who are concerned about the impacts of renters, affordable housing, all of those things. How have you seen the rights-based piece fit into that as a
I think I have a good example from Kitchener, which is a small town in Canada. So I mean, I can't say it's gone super smoothly, but they adopted a rights-based housing strategy to begin with, and that involved engaging in a whole diverse range of stakeholders. So it included the folks who would normally be against mixed neighborhoods, integrated living, all that stuff. So they were already being engaged through that process. My sense is, and this is what I encourage governments to do, the government, like the mayor's office of Kitchener, just said, like, we have obligations as a government. And so we are required to make this city livable for everyone. And they have continuously done like education pieces. They do op-eds, they have a monthly newsletter or something like that that comes out, and they're constantly just pushing the message. It has not been easy. I mean, they have a homelessness problem. They tried to put them in like tiny homes, and anyway, there was no land for that. And then they ended up having to put them in a parking lot. And so, you know, it hasn't always gone smoothly. But one thing that I like about the mayor there is he is steadfast in his approach. He doesn't waver. He believes housing is a human right. He has for a long time. And he and his team have been just pushing the message constantly. And I think that's the only way to go. I think human rights are so nice that way, like in that there's a way in which governments can just simply say, sorry, that's our obligation. It's the law. It's my obligation. And I think that can be quite useful. Not smooth though. Do we go online now, or are there more online? Because there were two more in the room.
So we have Mike Davies. He is tuning in from Zimbabwe.
Oh.
And he is
Oh,
the
Mike.
coordinator of the International Alliance of Inhabitants.
Yeah.
And he asks, from an international perspective, any suggestions for us ultra-mondialists trying to over US exceptionalism and build networks with activists in the States?
I'm not sure I understand. I know Mike. Hello, Mike. I'm not sure I understand the question, to be honest. How to build networks with folks in the US? I mean, one, I think that that's super important. I do believe in global networks. I actually think we need a global network, and this is something the shift my organization is going to try to work on, a global network of financialized tenants, because the actors are global. And so it's pretty cool for a tenant who lives in a building owned by Acelius in Toronto to be able to connect with tenants in Sweden living in a building owned by Acelius, and tenants in the UK living in a building owned by Acelius. But I'm not sure what Mike is getting at exactly. I don't know if he has a follow-up so that I can chew on it. And maybe we'll take another question while we ask for that follow-up. Sure.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about informal housing, because you talked about the role of governments integrating community ideas and like using people's lived experiences. But so much of the world lives in this informal housing. So when governments try and integrate social housing, they sort of, in a lot of ways, view those residents in informal housing as primary candidates for social housing, and then create sort of a separate entity, I guess. Like in my head, I'm thinking of even a well-meaning government like Lula's housing initiative, like Meeting House in Nevada, where he just created, or they created housing that was really far out from the city, really far from people's like communities or jobs. So have you seen any models that sort of, I guess, respect community agency and autonomy? And recognize that people constructed like formal housing in this location like for a reason, and understanding also that the way that people are living in this informal housing may not actually be like adequate. So I'm a little bit all over the place.
Such a good question, and I wrote a whole report on informal settlements and informality and what a human rights approach would be in that context, because you know, the Sustainable Development Goals include Target 11.1, so Goal 11, Target 11.1 includes that everyone by 2030 should have access to secure, affordable and safe housing or something like that, and the upgrading of informal settlements. And so your question is so on point to that, because the upgrading of informal settlements can often lead to really negative things for the people living in those informal settlements. So I thought, oh, I better write a report to provide some human rights guidance on what the upgrading of informal settlements might look like. And so one of the biggest problems, you know how I was talking about meaningful participation from a human rights perspective? That so rarely happens with informal settlements. If you, I mean, we can take something closer to home if that's more comfortable for some people who may not know what informal settlements look like overseas. So you take Skid Row in LA, that's a pretty good example of an informal settlement. But you can also equally take, you know, people living in Santiago, Chile, on the, you know, mountainside, you know, living informally, no formal title to the land. Or no recognized formal title to the land. And what often happens is government officials think that they know best and what should be done or what shouldn't be done. And people are either moved along into inappropriate housing or just simply evicted and not given any housing, and very, very, very rarely interacted with in a meaningful way. So, and all of that would be contrary to international human rights law, which I spell out in my report. So forced eviction of a community is considered a gross violation of the human right to housing. And there's a whole process that should unfold if you are trying or hoping to move a community, if you're a government, and that process requires meaningful engagement. There's lots of criteria that would have to be met. Some good examples. So in Mexico City, I was there a few years ago now, and this project took a long time, but Mexico has a scheme where they will regularize land. And by regularize, we mean you got people living on land, they don't have formal title, and there's a process by which they can basically get formal title. We call it regularization. And there was a group of indigenous peoples living in a building that wasn't really fit for living, but they've been living there for years and years. And they negotiated with government. It took 10 years before the land was regularized. And then with government support, and I think it was both the city government and national level government, like financial support, they rebuilt the building, and it was totally amazing. I mean, it was indigenous led. So they really had a say in what it was going to look like, how it was going to be shaped, formed, etc. They had a like what you call like a sweat lodge in the common area of the building. They had these beautiful indigenous murals up the side of the buildings. They had figured out a way to have like informal economy in the building. So when I walked to the building, I thought, oh, cool, that there are these sort of stores here, but it was all residents of the building selling their wares. Totally amazing. So, I mean, see what can happen, right? If you just respect people's rights, it's just like amazing. And another example, a little bit different, in Indonesia, in Jakarta, I went to a community on a waterfront, and this is pretty topical because it was right on the edge of the water. And of course, Indonesia is a tsunami hotspot, climate change hotspot. I mean, Jakarta in particular. And there was real risk for this community. So the government wanted to evict them. Like that was how they were going to mitigate the potential tragedy of climate change, right? So get rid of the community. And the community, so let's say this is the waterfront. the community homes were like this, all built like this. So the community suggested to the government, you know, what if we just cut our homes in half? That's what they agreed. The community thought, what if we just, so the government went for it. I think it was the governor of Jakarta has a governor structure. It was the governor of Jakarta agreed. And they literally cut their homes in half so that they were further away from the water, and that mitigated, and they ended up being able to stay in that community. It's since become a zero waste community. So again, a pretty amazing outcome. They were very much, they were not climate deniers, but they very much wanted to live on the land and deal with climate change in their own way. I think they ended up growing also mangroves in front of their homes, because rather than putting up like a cement wall to keep the waters from coming onto their homes. So like pretty nice examples. You know, this amazes me, like people, you know, I've seen this in the States too, in informal homeless communities. The ingenuity of people is amazing. What people can do. I mean, I went to a homeless encampment in Berkeley where they had established a detox tent with this minister, a woman who had been a minister in a church, and she knew how to do detox properly. So they had like this detox tent, they had solar panels, like people are amazing if we just give people a chance. And governments have a hard time because it means ceding power to some degree, right? It means giving up something. And they worked hard to get elected, a lot of these governments, and they feel that they have been elected and that they should be the decision makers. And it's hard to cede power. I mean, I'm a parent, I know that it is hard to cede power back. The results are always better if you talk to people. Okay, how are we going? Are we in the room or online?
Hi, I'm Delight. I'm actually a human security major. First of all, thank you for the documentary. I'm a flight attendant, so I travel a lot, and I saw a lot of the things that you described, and it gave a little bit more meaning to it than my observation.
Cool.
And I'm also a person that lived in Harlem and was priced out by a slum landlord, you know, due to decay and everything. But I was privileged enough to be able to move away and then join a class action lawsuit and, you know, get some justice, but I'm still waiting for it, right? But that's my privilege to have. Currently, I looked at the Eviction Lab, which is a website that tracks 6 states and 31 cities.
Yeah.
They track the evictions that landlords give. And in Pittsburgh alone, we have 10,225 evictions
In
Pittsburgh alone.
is it in a year or?
Since March of 2020. Just
Yeah, so 2 years.
right.
Yeah.
So when
That
we try
seems
to help
quite-
those people that are in this situation and they don't have the privilege like me to move away or start a new life somewhere, like appealing to a lawyer saying, it is my human right, doesn't really help. Like, what are actions that these people can actually really grasp on and to further their rights, so to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you raise. We're in a state in the US where you can't just go in some court or a tribunal and say, hey, I've got a right to housing. And it's even more complicated here because in some ways, although the right to housing is understood as what we call customary law, in other words, you kind of can't dispute it. It exists under international human rights law. The US hasn't ratified the main treaty that enumerates the right to housing. So the US has ratified the treaty that protects the right to life and to racial discrimination. So, but you're right. It's not useful in that way, I don't think. Where it's useful is to get laws changed so that they comply with the international right. And this thing about evictions, I mean, under international human rights law, an eviction into homelessness is considered a prima facie violation of the right to housing. There should be no, even if it's illegal, it is a legal eviction. It should never lead to homelessness. And so what you need is legislation that mirrors that says there shall be no evictions into homelessness. And then you need, and I don't know what your landlord tenant legislation is like here, so someone's going to fill my head with that knowledge, I think, over the course of this week. I'm really hoping. But what you need, not just the legislation, then, okay, well, how the frick do you do that, right? Well, there are models out of other countries. In Spain, for example, it doesn't always work. So, you know, we have to make models as best we can. But so when someone receives an eviction notice, they are then paired with a sort of social team or like social worker team that then works with them and the landlord to determine either how the person can stay in that unit or to find the person another place to live. And that is so hugely important. And most of you know about the book Evicted, and you know that, I mean, eviction is a quick way to homelessness, period. Very scary. And imagine the trauma, the emotional trauma, the anxiety. I mean, it's just, eviction is horrible, horrible, horrible in every way, shape, and form. And so we need to push governments to figure out ways to avoid, in particular, evictions into where it's clear the person or family might end up homeless. It's not enough. That's not sufficient. We need way better tenant protections. Way better tenant protections. We need landlords to understand they're in the business of a human right. That's what, and that's what I'm constantly telling the private sector as well as governments. Sorry, it's not like any other business. It's not a convenience store. It's a human right. I mean, surely that should change business practice. So,
Like, if I may
Yeah.
add, my colleague earlier said it best, like for some people that is their hard-earned money that they put in, and you just have this house, so you have to make mortgage payments too. Like, I understand it's a human house and I'm not disputing that, but like, shouldn't the state have any other mechanism to overcome that? You give examples that are really great, but they're more applicable in socialized countries like Europe. Or Canada as well. The whole concept of what is human right and human, you know, it's just different than here in the United States. I just don't see
I
those
don't know
things.
about that. Canada has one of the most liberalized housing markets in the world. We also have, I think now, the second most expensive housing market in the world. So Canada's not a socialized country. I'm just giving you examples of things that have happened that are good. So I don't know if I totally understand your point.
I'm just saying, you keep on saying that the state has a responsibility. Shouldn't the state at least pay for my legal fines, or, you know, for a lawyer, or help me find a lawyer when I find myself in this situation, if that is my right, right?
Part of the right to housing involves access to justice. And you can't have access to justice if you can't afford a legal aid lawyer or a lawyer of some sort. Absolutely. You need venues, places to go to claim your right to housing. When I talk with governments, that is probably the hardest thing to convince them of. We've started to try to come up with different mechanisms rather than courts. So the idea of councils, for example, housing advocates, so that they, you know, a city, for example, you here have the city's fair housing commission, or whatever it's called, Commission on Human Relations, I guess. I actually wonder if that couldn't be a more robust, and I think they're wondering that, whether they couldn't play a more robust role in protecting people's rights. I noticed in their report, they said that they normally get a majority of complaints around discrimination in the employment sector, but that's changing, and that housing complaints have started to really increase. So they could play a really important role. And the nice thing about non-court venues for access to justice is they tend to be friendlier, like easier for people to access, cheaper. You might even be able to navigate the system alone without a lawyer, or maybe just with a paralegal, or, you know, et cetera. So Yeah, I didn't mean to overemphasize the role of government, although government has to lead. But yeah, there need to be other mechanisms to ensure that the right to housing is implemented. Yeah. Hope I answered it.
Yeah, totally.
I think on that note, we'll have to conclude. Please join me in welcoming